Basically, Mr. President, even as the price of crude continues to climb above $100, and we're talking about energy now and all the regulations, this administration continues to promote domestic energy policies that are making it more expensive for Americans to put gas in their cars, heat their homes, power their businesses. Just yesterday in a town hall meeting in Johnson County in Kansas, I heard complaints about the rising gas prices and our dependence on foreign oil and the need to develop our own domestic resources, all of those resources. But this vital goal is now extremely difficult on the administration's own policies, again, affecting not only energy, but agriculture and our financial institutions and health care. I call them the four horsemen of regulatory strangulation. That may be a little harsh, but I don't think it is. Mr. President, as I said last week when I came to the floor and highlighted a multitude of new overly burdensome and in many situations absurd EPA regulations that will have a significant negative effect on the ability of our farmers and our ranchers to produce the food and the crops necessary to compete in a global market and to feed a troubled and hungry world. Just take a look at the coverage in regards to Libya and the news blip that we saw on television where somebody was shouting and protesting, and one of our news people stuck a microphone in front of his face and said, are you trying to promote democracy? And he said, no, I just want a loaf of bread. I will say to you that a hungry nation is a nation that does not have any possibility of economic opportunity, and then you get into a lot of problems leading, in fact, to terrorism, and all sorts of bad things happen. Well, unfortunately, as we all know, the EPA's reach goes well beyond the agriculture industry. Its regulations are moving to make the energy we rely on every day more expensive to produce, many times without providing any appreciable benefits to the environment. Nobody wants to do anything under the banner of clean air, clean water, or whatever the EPA is promulgating that would endanger the public health. But I think that we can take a good look at some of these regulations, and in regards to any appreciable benefits to the environment, they are few and far between. Since fiscal year 2010, Mr. President, 10 new regulations promulgated by the EPA have accounted for over $23 billion in new costs to the American taxpayer, costs which are even more painful for Americans as our nation continues to struggle with an almost 9% unemployment rate. Unfortunately, with the number of proposed regulations currently before our domestic energy producers, and if we do not take action, we meaning the Congress, 2011 and beyond will be even costlier. Now, for example, EPA has proposed to amend the current national ambient air quality standards for ozone to a range of 60 to 70 parts per billion. I think the current standard is 75. They want to lower it down. Every time they lower it down, it gets more stringent. A range so stringent that recent analysis estimates that hundreds of thousands of jobs would be at risk because of city and counties' inability to meet these attainment levels. I remember some years ago, quite a few years ago, I was trying to find out the apparatus that the EPA was using to measure the ambient air quality in Kansas City out by the airport, KCI. And it was during the summertime. And it was hot, and the wind was blowing. The wind blows in Kansas. And I'm sure that the ambient air quality in regards to dust particles and or wherever the wind was blowing over weeds or a certain crop was such that the apparatus that they used would be scoring the level above the ambient air quality standard. Sure enough, it was. And we found it. And it was on a three-legged stool, and it was a canister. Oh, it was about that high. I don't know what was in it. I didn't feel like it was within the purview of an individual congressman at that particular time to go over and take a look at that. But as a result of that, all of a sudden the word came that everybody in the Kansas City metropolitan area could no longer use their lawnmowers. Yeah, lawnmowers. You couldn't mow your lawn. Couldn't start it up, mow your lawn because of that one apparatus out at the Kansas City airport said, whoops, ambient air quality was higher, or was higher than the standard that was proposed. I suppose that was 75 parts per billion. I mean, there's a little bit of something everywhere in everything with the amount of sound science that we use today. But lawnmowers, I mean, people were driving to work, people were farming, the power plants were still operating, but the average person in Kansas City who wanted to use the lawnmower, sorry, couldn't do it. That's ridiculous. The EPA itself has estimated that this new regulation would cost between $19 and $90 billion when fully implemented. I'm talking about the 60 to 70 parts per billion. It provides no rationale as to what new scientific data justifies updating a standard as recently said as 2008. Let's just go back to the 2008 standard. Why on earth are you going to cost people anywhere between $19 and $90 billion when fully implemented would you just automatically lower the standard? And you don't have any scientific data that justifies that. This proposed regulation is in addition to recently enacted greenhouse gas regulations requiring application of the best available control technology. Who decides that? Well, that's the Kansas Department of Health and Environment with the EPA looking over their shoulder. And it is the application of best available control technology for stationary sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this regulation currently only affects those stationary sources of energy, the ones that are right there, emitting 75,000 or more tons of carbon per year, and which are already subject to the prevention of significant deterioration. They call them PSDs. I tell you, get into this and start looking at the acronyms. More acronyms you can shake a stick at, but PSD stands for Prevention of Significant Deterioration. Permitting requirements for non-greenhouse gases. They're called GHGs, GUGs. That's the acronym. The other one, well, I won't try to pronounce the other one. Future implementations of this rule could negatively impact millions of small businesses, farms, hospitals, and community organizations with a cost of over $75 billion a year. So we're talking billions and billions and billions in regards to these regulations. According to the Affordable Power Alliance, that's a civil rights organization, by the year 2030, greenhouse gases, with regard to regulations trying to control them, specifically targeting our domestic energy producers, will result in the loss of 2.5 million jobs, and a reduction of household income of $1,200 a year. Now, keep in mind, these are impacts that will have the greatest negative impact on poor households, low-income households, who spend a greater percentage of their monthly income on utilities and groceries, necessities made more expensive to produce and purchase with rising energy prices. In the area of energy recycling, EPA officials are preparing to release a final ruling on regulation of coal combustion byproducts. The acronym for that is CCB, which I hope avoids any classification of this product as a hazardous waste. CCBs are, of course, an unavoidable residual of burning coal to create energy, which I'd like to add is the most cost-effective form of energy available still, and is responsible for providing over 70% of the energy to my state's taxpayers, 70%. Classification of this byproduct as a hazardous waste will restrict further beneficial use of CCBs in a multitude of industries, including agriculture, Portland cement, home construction, and without providing definitive benefits to the environment. In my home state of Kansas, Mr. President, representatives speaking on behalf of a number of Kansas energy producers estimated cost to industry of over $300 billion over the next 5 years to comply with a multitude of proposed EPA regulations dealing with air, water, and CCB management. Again, coal combustion byproducts. $300 billion. That's just, that's unreasonable, and that's probably the mildest thing I can say. These are real numbers that will doubtlessly drive up the cost of energy that Kansans rely on to heat their homes, drive our nation's agriculture industry. Unfortunately, the negative impacts resulting from the multitude of new, overly burdensome EPA regulations don't stop with agriculture and energy. Beyond affecting the way people power their homes and businesses, the administration has even moved to regulate what cars can Americans drive. Now, this was made evident by the EPA and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's decision last year to begin mandating greater fuel economy and emission standards for all passenger vehicles and light-duty trucks, something that I think a lot of Americans support that. A lot of people in this body support that. Recent analysis, however, has estimated this new regulation will cost the already struggling automobile industry upwards of $10.8 billion to comply, and consumers up to about $1,000 per vehicle in higher purchases prices. They just pass the cost on, so if you're going to buy a new pickup down the road, it's be $1,000 more. Now, while EPA has garnered much of the attention in my state for its efforts to make energy more expensive, from a national perspective, the Department of Interior shares similar responsibility for pursuing policies that not only make energy more expensive, but also makes our country more reliant on foreign and oftentimes unfriendly sources of energy. For example, under the current administration, the Department of Interior has canceled 77 oil development leases granted just a few years ago in Utah that were located within a larger formation covering 3 states that the Bureau of Land Management has estimated contains about 800 billion barrels of oil, more than 3 times the proven reserves in Saudi Arabia. Why? Why would we shut that down when the leases were granted just a few years ago? Not enough environmental oversight. That question has to be asked and answered. 800 billion barrels of oil. No, we can't go do that. This, of course, is in addition to the Gulf of Mexico deepwater drilling moratorium imposed last summer, which had a lasting negative effect on the Gulf Coast economies. The President said, yes, you can go ahead and drill, but the safety regulations are such that a lot of companies that were drilling have left or are leaving. However, foreign competition is drilling in the same place. That just doesn't make sense. Beyond the regulatory burdens, it's also essential we focus on removing redundant programs within the various federal agencies. Listen up. Every upset taxpayer should know this, and more important, demand action from this Congress. Last month, the administration's own Government Accountability Office, the famous or infamous GAO, released a report highlighting hundreds of duplicative programs currently on the books that cost American taxpayers billions of dollars every year. Now, you get into double digits when you're counting the number of programs that all of us would like to depend on and all of us think are important. But they're duplicative. We're doing the same thing. As I say, costing American taxpayers billions of dollars every year. Now, this is separate from the regulatory oversight. This study further amplifies the importance that we must take a serious look at our federal agencies and put in place appropriate oversight, review, and revocation where needed. Mr. President, it is for these reasons that I believe that Congress must move forward with solutions that remove overly burdensome regulations and creates an environment that doesn't hinder energy production and use of those resources that make the most economic sense while still protecting, yes, our clean water, clean air, and do what we can in regards to CO2 emissions. Understanding this, last month I, along with 30 other senators, introduced the bill I was talking about, the Regulatory Responsibility for Our Economy Act. The bill moves to codify and strengthen the President's January 18th executive order that directs agencies within the administration to review, modify, streamline, expand, or repeal those significant regulatory actions that are duplicative, unnecessarily, overly burdensome, or would have significant economic impacts on Americans. That's the President's wordage right there. I agree with it. I applaud the President for saying that. However, I agree in principle with President Obama that we need to take that serious look at both current and proposed federal regulations, but I don't believe his executive order actually does what it purports to do. Too many loopholes, no teeth. Specifically, my bill moves to hold accountable independent agencies which are exempt under his executive order, the FDIC, the SEC, the EPA, that are not covered under President Obama's executive order. The EPA came up and said, well, we're doing the public good, and then they followed that crazy paragraph I'm going to read in just a minute and said, well, we're okay, we're not issuing any regulations that hurt anybody. I just attended the Commodity Classic made up of all farm organizations, all commodity groups out in Great Bend, Kansas. Number one issue, regulations. Why on earth are you putting out all these regulations that are about to put us out of business? And you just go right down the line in any group, any association, any business, all throughout America. Pat, what are you doing strangling us with all these regulations? What are you guys doing? My response is, I'm an us guy. I'm trying to do something about it. Specifically, my bill moves to hold accountable these independent agencies. It also removes from the executive order highly subjective language that directs each agency to use the best available techniques to quantify anticipated and present and future benefits and costs as accurately as possible. Here comes the paragraph that I defy you, Mr. President. I defy any of our highly skilled and educated people there on the dais. I defy this nice young lady who is taking down my words as best she can, anybody in the galleries that I'm not supposed to mention, or anybody. Listen to this. Each agency may consider and discuss qualitatively. This is the way that they look at a regulation to determine whether or not they're going to issue that regulation or not. And they're going to discuss qualitatively values that are difficult or impossible to quantify, including equity, human dignity, fairness, and distributive impacts. That statement is amorphous. It is synonymous with amorphous. I defy anybody to try to determine what that means, except what you want it to mean. So, that statement now wins the Gobbledygook Award of the Month. And I think I'm going to come down here every month and award a gobbledygook statement in the regulatory field that are about to drown us all as the gobbledygook statement of the month. And that sure hits it. It doesn't take a legislative scholar to understand that this language creates a loophole large enough to drive a grain truck through and renders the order meaningless. That is why passage of my legislation is so critically important. In closing, I invite my friends on both sides of the aisle, please, to sign on as a co-sponsor of my legislation, realizing the immense opportunities it creates for meaningful review, possible revocation of regulations to counter our nation's growth, along with the GAO report outlawing specific duplication of federal programs, a report that defies PowerPoints or charts, couldn't do it, a maze of too many programs trying to do the same thing. If we don't do this, we're going to cost the business community of America and all Americans billions and billions of dollars and get nothing in return in regards to environmental benefits. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor, and I notice the absence of a quorum.